The courthouse hallway smelled of old wood and floor wax, a sterile combination that did nothing to calm Mitchell's racing heart. She sat rigidly on the wooden bench outside courtroom 7, her leg bouncing with nervous energy that she couldn't quite control. Beside her, clutching a worn stuffed bunny with one hand and her mother's hand with the other, was Sarah, her beautiful, broken 3-year-old daughter. Glanced down at her child's face, pale and drawn far beyond her years, and felt the familiar wave of guilt wash over her. It hadn't always been this way. Could still clearly remember Sarah at 2 years old, bright-eyed, curious, constantly asking questions about everything she saw. "Mama, why?" had been Sarah's favorite phrase, delivered with an infectious giggle that could light up any room. She'd love to sing, to dance, to play with her dolls for hours. She'd been fearless in that innocent way only small children can be, running through the house with her arms spread wide like an airplane, making engine noises that drove crazy but also brought her such joy. That Sarah felt like a ghost now, a shadow of a memory. 6 months ago, everything changed in the span of 15 terrifying minutes. It was supposed to be a normal Tuesday afternoon. Had been working a double shift at the hospital where she was a nursing assistant, and her mother had agreed to watch Sarah while ex-partner Daniel visited. The arrangement was supposed to be safe, supervised by her mother, contained within her mother's home, with clear boundaries established by their family lawyer. Daniel had been cooperative about the custody agreement, had seemed genuinely interested in maintaining a relationship with his daughter despite their separation, had no reason to believe that day would be anything other than ordinary. Then came the phone call that shattered her world. Her mother's voice had been barely recognizable, hyperventilating, terrified, crying so hard they could barely understand the words. "There's men. They have guns. They're inside the house. I've locked Sarah in the closet. Call 911. Please call 911. The line had gone dead. Remembered standing in the hospital hallway, her phone falling from her fingers, her legs unable to support her weight. A colleague had caught her as she collapsed, and the next 20 minutes were a blur of emergency response and desperate driving across the city with her heart in her throat. The police had already breached the house by the time arrived, their sirens still wailing, their lights painting the neighborhood in alternating red and blue. She'd been escorted past the yellow crime scene tape, past the officers taking statements, into a house that had been transformed into a war zone. Furniture overturned, drawers ransacked, money and jewelry scattered across the floor. Daniel was in custody. He'd allegedly owed money to dangerous people, and this had been their way of collecting. But barely registered these details. Her entire world had narrowed to one desperate question: where was Sarah? Her mother sat in the kitchen, wrapped in a police-issued blanket, her face hollow with shock. "She's in the closet," she whispered, her voice broken. "I told her to be very quiet and I locked the door. She was so scared, she kept asking for you." Had run to the bedroom closet, her hands shaking so violently she could barely turn the lock. When she opened the door, she found her daughter huddled in the corner, surrounded by winter coats, her tiny body trembling uncontrollably. Sarah was silent, that terrified silence that is somehow worse than screaming, because it means a child has retreated so far into fear that even her own voice can't reach her anymore. "Mama," Sarah's voice had been barely a whisper, hollow and haunted. Had scooped her daughter into her arms, and that was when Sarah began to scream. Not words, not recognizable sounds, just raw, primal screams of terror that seemed to come from somewhere broken deep inside her small body. Those screams had lasted for hours, even after they'd arrived at the emergency room, even after the doctors had examined Sarah and confirmed she had no physical injuries. The screams were internal injuries, the kind that couldn't be bandaged or stitched. Now, 6 months later, sitting in the courthouse hallway, those screams still echoed in nightmares. The changes in Sarah had been gradual but devastating. The cheerful chatter was gone, replaced by long stretches of silence. The curiosity that had once made her a whirlwind of questions had vanished, leaving behind a withdrawn child who barely made eye contact. Sarah had developed elaborate rituals. She insisted on checking the locks on every door multiple times before bed. She'd panic if left the room. She'd wake up screaming from nightmares almost every night. The night terrors were particularly bad. Sarah would wake gasping, her small body drenched in sweat, unable to explain what she'd seen in her dreams but clearly haunted by something terrible. Had taken her to a pediatric trauma specialist who diagnosed her with acute post-traumatic stress disorder. The word disorder made it sound so clinical, so manageable, but living with it was anything but manageable. It meant watching your daughter flinch at unexpected sounds. It meant seeing panic bloom across her face when a car door slammed. It meant listening to her cry herself to sleep because she was afraid to dream. It meant feeling like you'd failed to protect your child from the worst parts of the world. The custody hearing today was about Daniel. The court needed to determine if contact with him could resume and under what circumstances. His lawyer had been clear. We need Sarah to communicate to the judge. We need her to demonstrate how traumatized she still is. The judge needs to hear from her, see her state. But how could you ask a child who'd been traumatized to relive it? How could you expect her to perform her pain for the legal system? Had tried to prepare Sarah, to explain in simple terms what would happen, but the anxiety in her daughter's eyes had broken her heart all over again. As they sat in the hallway now, waiting to be called into the courtroom, could feel Sarah's small hand gripping hers with white-knuckle intensity. Her daughter hadn't spoken much all morning, just a few whispered words and mostly fearful looks. The stuffed bunny, named Pepper, had become Sarah's constant companion, a small bridge to a sense of safety in a world that had proven itself to be profoundly unsafe. Squeezed her daughter's hand gently. "Sweetie, remember what I told you. The judge is a nice lady. She just wants to help make sure you're safe, and I'll be right there with you. I'm not going anywhere." Sarah looked up at her mother with eyes far too old for her young face. "Will the bad men come back?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a fear that no 3-year-old should ever have to carry. Felt tears prick her eyes. She wanted to promise that the world was safe, that nothing bad would ever happen again. But she couldn't lie to her daughter anymore. The world had shown Sarah its face and couldn't pretend otherwise. All she could do was hold her close and hope that somehow today's hearing would lead to real protection, real healing, real safety. That's when the courtroom doors opened, and a voice called their names. Took a deep breath, stood up, and lifted Sarah into her arms. Her daughter clung to her desperately as they walked toward the courtroom. Whispered a silent prayer to a God she wasn't sure was listening. "Please help my baby. Please help her find her voice again." They had no idea what was about to happen inside that courtroom, how a chance encounter would change everything. Officer Robert had been with the police department for 17 years, but his career had taken a meaningful turn 8 years ago when he first met Dakota. That day had changed not just his professional path, but his entire understanding of what justice could mean. Most people thought of police dogs as intimidating patrol animals, tools for apprehension and protection. But Robert had discovered something far more profound: the healing power of an animal's unconditional presence during humanity's darkest moments. Dakota was an 8-year-old German shepherd with a coat the color of rich chocolate and eyes that seemed to contain ancient wisdom. He wasn't the largest dog had ever worked with, nor was he the most physically impressive. What made Dakota extraordinary was something less tangible, a spiritual quality that seemed to resonate with traumatized individuals, particularly children. The dog had been specifically bred and trained through a specialized program run by the Victim Advocacy Council. Out of a cohort of 12 puppies that began training together, only 3 had the particular temperament required for victim support work. Dakota had excelled beyond everyone's expectations. Still remembered Dakota's early training days. As a young dog, Dakota had demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to sense emotional distress. During training exercises, Dakota could somehow identify which person in a room was experiencing anxiety or fear, even when that person was trying to hide it. He would naturally gravitate toward them, positioning himself at a comfortable distance and simply offer his presence. No aggression, no excitement, just calm, steadfast companionship. It was as if Dakota understood on some deep level that certain people needed not commands or control, but acceptance and safety. The bond between and Dakota had developed over thousands of hours of work together. They'd been through formal training, continuing education programs, and countless real-world scenarios. But what truly connected them was something beyond professional. It was love. Had chosen to bring Dakota home, to let him live as a family dog rather than just an on-duty asset. Dakota had become his partner in every sense of the word. They jogged together in the mornings, they ate breakfast together, they slept in the same house. Dakota was part of his life and was utterly devoted to his dogs and happiness. Over the past 8 years, Dakota and Had worked together on more than 200 cases. They'd comforted abused children in emergency rooms. They'd sat with frightened witnesses waiting to testify. They'd provided emotional support to families who'd experienced unimaginable trauma. Each case left an imprint on his heart. He'd learned that the work they did didn't always show up in conviction rates or closed cases. Sometimes, the real victory was simply seeing a child smile again, or hearing a victim speak their truth instead of remaining locked in silence. New Dakota's resumed by heart. He could recite it in his sleep. The dog had received certifications in victim support, trauma response, and crisis intervention. He'd completed hundreds of hours of behavioral training. He understood when to approach and when to maintain distance. He knew how to position himself to provide comfort without being overwhelming. He could distinguish between fear, grief, anger, and confusion based on subtle shifts in human body language. But the most important skill Dakota possessed was something no certificate could convey: the ability to make people feel that they weren't alone in their pain. The morning of Sarah's hearing had woken early, as he always did on days when they had victim support assignments. He'd opened his eyes to find Dakota already awake, watching him with that familiar intensity that suggested the dog somehow knew the importance of the day ahead. Believed Dakota could sense his anxiety through their bond. They'd been together so long that they were attuned to each other's energy in ways that bordered on telepathic. "You ready for this, buddy?" Had asked, running his hand over Dakota's silky head. The dog had responded by placing his paw on his chest, a gesture they'd developed over years of companionship that meant acceptance and commitment. It was Dakota's way of saying, "I'm here. Let's do this together." Had prepared Dakota's grooming with particular attention that morning. He'd brushed his coat until it gleamed, not for vanity, but because it mattered. When people were at their most vulnerable, small details sometimes provided comfort. A well-groomed, clean dog suggested order and care in a world that often felt chaotic and cruel. Had also prepared himself mentally, reviewing Sarah's case file one more time. He'd read the police reports, studied the trauma assessment conducted by the child psychologist, and reviewed the notes from the social worker who'd been tracking Sarah's case. The little girl had suffered immensely. That much was clear from every document, but had also learned something crucial during his years of victim support work. Children were resilient in ways that adults often forgot. They had the capacity to heal, to trust again, to find light even after experiencing profound darkness. Sometimes all they needed was the right catalyst, the right moment, the right presence that conveyed, "It's safe to let people help you now." Dakota seemed to understand that this case was different from their routine work. As drove them to the courthouse that morning, the dog sat in his usual seat, but his body language was more alert, his attention more focused. When they pulled into the parking lot, Dakota had pressed his nose against the window, as if studying the building they were about to enter. Swore that sometimes the dog could smell fear or trauma the way others could smell rain in the air. Dakota seemed to be preparing himself, mentally shifting into his victim support mode. As they walked through the courthouse corridors, other officers nodded in recognition. Dakota had become something of a legend in the courthouse community. Law enforcement officers, court clerks, and regular courthouse staff all knew the story of the German Shepherd who healed with his presence. There were stories about the teenager who'd finally disclosed her abuser after refusing to speak for months, who'd suddenly opened up while petting Dakota's fur. There was the story about the elderly man who'd witnessed a crime and been too traumatized to testify until Dakota had sat beside him, somehow transferring calm and courage. There was the story about the mother who'd broken down crying and finally sought help, all because she'd let Dakota's unconditional acceptance crack through her denial and shame. Had learned not to announce Dakota's presence to potential clients beforehand. He discovered that sometimes the dog worked best when the introduction was organic, when a traumatized person encountered Dakota by surprise and could make their own choice about whether to engage. The spontaneity of the encounter often led to more genuine connections than prepared interactions. This morning, as they approached Courtroom 7, reviewed the case one final time in his mind. Sarah was 3 years old. She'd witnessed a violent home invasion. She hadn't spoken more than a few words in 6 months. The court needed to determine custody, but more importantly, Sarah needed to find her voice again. She needed to reconnect with trust, with safety, with the possibility that adults and the world could be good. Looked down at Dakota, and the dog looked up at him with complete faith and readiness. "Okay, brother," whispered, "let's go meet a little girl who needs us." As they walked toward Courtroom 7, felt the familiar settling that always happened before a major victim support intervention, a sense of purpose that reminded him why he'd become a police officer in the first place. It wasn't about arrests or statistics. It was about moments like this, about being present when someone needed help finding their way back to hope. Dakota's tail had stopped wagging. The playful sparkle in his eyes had been replaced by focused intention. The dog knew what was coming. Somehow, he always knew. They pushed through the courtroom doors together, a man and his dog, ready to help a broken child remember that the world still contained goodness. Judge had been sitting on the bench for 23 years, and in that time, she'd learned that every case carried its own particular weight. But some cases pressed harder than others, and Sarah Mitchell's custody hearing was already pressing so heavily that could feel it like a physical burden on her shoulders before she'd even put on her black robe. She'd arrived at the courthouse an hour earlier than necessary, as she always did on sensitive cases. Believed in being prepared not just legally, but emotionally and mentally. She'd sat in her chambers, a modest office lined with law books and photographs of her own, and spent time simply breathing, centering herself, reminding herself of why she'd chosen this profession. At 62 years old, had seen the legal system at its best and worst. She'd presided over cases that brought justice and healing, and she'd presided over cases where the system had failed spectacularly. She'd learned to carry both experiences with equal gravity. The case file sat open on her desk, and she'd reviewed it multiple times in the past week. The facts were clear. A violent home invasion had occurred during a supervised custody visit. The defendant, Daniel, had allegedly owed money to dangerous individuals who'd used the invasion as a form of debt collection. The police reports were thorough, multiple perpetrators, weapons displayed, threats made. Daniel's culpability was complicated. He hadn't participated in the violence, but his debts had created the circumstances that led to it. Sarah's presence in the home that day had been coincidental, tragic fate. What worried most wasn't the legal questions. The law was relatively clear about custody suspension in cases involving violence and child endangerment. What kept her awake at night was the child. She'd received the psychological evaluation of Sarah Mitchell, and the language in those reports was heartbreaking. Acute post-traumatic stress disorder, behavioral regression, selective mutism, severe anxiety responses, disrupted attachment behavior. Academic terms that represented a shattered childhood. Had also received the social worker's notes, which described home visits with a child who was withdrawn, fearful, and barely communicating. Sarah had reportedly made almost no progress in 6 months despite therapy and a safe home environment. The question that haunted was, what happens when a child can't tell her story? How does a judge protect someone who cannot advocate for themselves? When she'd begun her career, had believed that the courtroom was a space for truth and justice. 2 decades later, she understood that the courtroom was often a space where truth struggled to emerge, especially when that truth came from the most vulnerable members of society. Children couldn't always articulate their experiences in ways that satisfied legal standards. Trauma didn't present itself neatly or logically. Sometimes the most profound truths were expressed through silence, through fear, through the body's involuntary responses rather than through words. Had checked the courtroom layout this morning as she always did. The building had renovations 5 years ago specifically to create a less intimidating environment for child witnesses. The judge's bench had been lowered slightly. The witness stand was positioned at a less aggressive angle. The lighting was softer, warmer. The room had been painted in soothing blues and greens rather than institutional grays. But for all these accommodations, the courtroom still was what it was, a formal space of authority and power. A small child sitting in the witness stand was a child surrounded by all the weight of the legal system bearing down on her. At 9:15 a.m., put on her robe and prepared to enter the courtroom. She stopped in front of the mirror and looked at her reflection, an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, deep lines around her eyes from decades of serious decisions, a posture that conveyed authority. She knew that when she entered that courtroom, people would straighten in their seats. Lawyers would put away their phones. Security officers would stand at attention. Her presence commanded respect and submission to her authority. She wondered, not for the first time, what that presence must feel like to a 3-year-old child who was already terrified. The courtroom was arranged precisely as had envisioned it. To the left sat Mitchell with her attorney, a competent woman named Sarah who'd handled several custody cases in his courtroom. To the right sat Daniel in a suit that was clearly rented for the occasion, his attorney beside him, a man named Thomas Bradford who specialized in criminal defense but often represented clients in family court. Bradford was slick, practiced in the art of minimizing his client's culpability. Respected his skill, even as she braced herself against his tactics. The courtroom itself seemed to be holding its breath. The bailiff had arranged everything meticulously. The court reporter sat ready to document every word spoken. The victim advocate sat in the back, a woman named Gloria who'd been with the department for 10 years and had the quiet compassion that found essential in this work. And there, in the designated support area, sat Officer Robert with his German shepherd, Dakota. Knew of and Dakota. Their reputation had preceded them. She'd read about the cases they'd worked, about the remarkable way Dakota seemed to unlock the voices of traumatized children. She'd been skeptical at first. It seemed like the kind of thing people wanted to believe in but that rarely worked in practice. But the case outcomes had impressed her. Over and over again, child witnesses who'd been unable or unwilling to testify had suddenly found their voices in Dakota's presence. The dog seemed to create a kind of safe space that transcended legal procedure. When she'd approved Dakota's presence in the courtroom this morning, had done so with a sense of cautious hope. She understood that she was operating at the boundaries of conventional procedure. Other judges might have refused, but had long ago learned that rigid adherence to procedure sometimes prevented justice from being served. If a dog could help a traumatized child communicate her truth, then that dog belonged in her courtroom. The courtroom doors opened and Mitchell entered, carrying Sarah in her arms. His entire focus shifted. Everything else, the lawyers, the procedures, the legal arguments, faded into the background. She was looking at a 3-year-old child who looked far too small for the weight she was carrying, far too fragile for the questions that would be asked of her. Sarah was dressed carefully, probably in her nicest outfit, probably wearing clothes that her mother had chosen specifically to present her as a credible witness. but no amount of careful clothing could hide the child's terror. Even from her elevated position on the bench, could see Sarah's tiny body trembling. She could see the way the little girl gripped her stuffed bunny like a lifeline. She could see the fear in Sarah's eyes, not the normal wariness of an unfamiliar place, but deep, existential fear rooted in trauma. Felt something shift inside her, something that happened in these moments when she was confronted with the reality of human suffering. It was the part of her that had made her want to become a judge in the first place, the part that believed that even in systems imperfect and flawed, there was still the possibility of protection, of advocacy, of someone in power choosing to stand for those who could not stand for themselves. She looked from Sarah to Officer and Dakota. She could see in his demeanor that he understood the gravity of the moment. The dog sat with unusual stillness, as if sensing the profound need in the room. Judge settled herself on the bench, gavel in hand, and looked out at the courtroom. "We are in session," she said, her voice steady and measured. "Let's call our first witness." But before that happened, before the formal questioning began, made a silent promise to herself. She would not let procedure trump compassion. She would not let legal formality silence a traumatized child. Whatever it took, she would help Sarah find her voice. She had no idea yet that the key to that voice would arrive on 4 legs. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Mitchell took the witness stand. Her hand trembled slightly as she raised her right hand to swear an oath. She'd sworn 1,000 times in her nightmares, but never before officially in a courtroom. Judge nodded to her with what looked like genuine compassion, and felt a small measure of strength flow back into her body. She was doing this for Sarah. Every word, every painful memory she was about to recount, it was all for her daughter. Sarah's attorney began with gentle questions designed to establish credibility and her relationship with her daughter. "Can you describe what Sarah was like before the incident?" Ms. Mitchell asked, her tone carefully calibrated to be both professional and empathetic. His eyes glistened as she began to speak. She was incredible, bright, curious about everything. She had this infectious laugh, it could light up an entire room. She was fearless in that innocent way only little kids can be. She loved to sing, to dance, to play with her dolls for hours. She asked questions constantly, "Mama, why this?" and "Mama, why that?" I used to joke that she wore me out with all her questions, but honestly, I'd give anything to hear her ask me a million more questions right now. His voice had begun to waver, and Judge handed her a tissue box from the bench. Took one with gratitude, composed herself briefly, and continued. "That was my Sarah before. That was the girl I knew." And after the incident, prompted gently. Took a shaky breath. This was the part she'd rehearsed in her head 100 times but still couldn't quite prepare herself for. Everything changed. It was like someone had switched off a light inside her. The singing stopped immediately. I don't think I've heard her sing even one note since that day. The dancing, the playing, it all just stopped. She became very quiet, very withdrawn. For the first week, I thought maybe she was processing, that she'd bounce back. But the weeks turned into months, and she got worse, not better. "Can you give the court specific examples?" asked. Twisted the tissue in her hands, her knuckles turning white with tension. She developed rituals. Before bed, she has to check every lock in the house, every single lock. She goes from door to door, sometimes checking the same door 2 or 3 times, and she won't settle down until she's convinced everything is locked. Even then, she won't sleep without me in the room. If I try to leave, she panics completely, hyperventilating, crying, asking me not to go. The courtroom was completely silent, was taking notes, her expression serious and attentive. "There are also the nightmares," continued, her voice breaking. "Almost every night Sarah wakes up screaming. Not normal child nightmares where they forget quickly. These are different. She's drenched in sweat, her heart is racing, and she's inconsolable. It takes me sometimes an hour to calm her down enough to fall back asleep. Some nights, I don't even try to put her in her own bed anymore because I know she won't stay there." "Has there been an incident with a loud noise?" asked, having reviewed these details within preparation. "Yes," said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Last week a car backfired outside our house. Sarah was playing in the living room and she just froze, complete freeze. She didn't cry or scream. She just went absolutely rigid, and for over an hour afterward she couldn't speak. She wouldn't move. I was terrified something was medically wrong with her, so I called her pediatrician, but he said it's a typical trauma response. Her nervous system basically shut down as a protective mechanism." Thomas Bradford, Daniel's attorney, stood to cross-examine. "Ms. Mitchell, isn't it possible that these symptoms could be exaggerated due to parental bias? That you might be interpreting normal childhood anxiety as pathological?" His eyes flashed with anger, but she maintained her composure. "I've been a nursing assistant for 8 years. I know the difference between normal childhood development and trauma responses. I've also taken her to a pediatric trauma specialist who diagnosed her with acute post-traumatic stress disorder. That's not my interpretation. That's a medical professional's diagnosis." "And what about before this incident?" Bradford continued. "Wasn't there already some instability in her home environment due to the custody arrangement and parental separation?" "She was thriving before," said firmly. "Yes, our separation wasn't ideal, but we handled it as carefully as we could. She had a schedule, a routine, consistent care from 2 parents who both loved her deeply. The only instability in her life came from that home invasion. That's the variable that changed everything." Judge interjected. "Counsel, I think the medical documentation speaks for itself. Let's move forward." Bradford sat down with a slight frown. Then came the moment had been dreading most. Judge turned her attention towards Sarah, who was sitting in the front row beside the victim advocate Gloria. "I think we need to hear from the child," said carefully. "Gloria, can you bring Sarah to the stand, please?" Gloria, who had 2 decades of experience with frightened children, approached Sarah gently. "Sweetheart, the judge would like to talk to you for just a few minutes. Can you come with me?" Gloria offered her hand, speaking in the softest voice imaginable. Sarah looked up at her mother with eyes filled with terror, mouthed the words, "It's okay, baby, just tell the truth." But they both knew it wasn't okay. It wasn't okay at all. Gloria carried Sarah to the witness stand. Even with the courtroom's child-friendly modifications, the witness stand felt impossibly large compared to Sarah's tiny frame. Gloria remained close by, standing just beyond the stand's edge, providing a visual anchor of safety. Judge leaned forward slightly, ensuring her voice was as warm and non-threatening as possible. "Hi, Sarah. My name is Judge. I'm so glad you could come talk to me today. Can you tell me your name?" Sarah's lips parted, but no sound emerged. She was staring at something none of them could see. Perhaps the memory of that day, perhaps the masked faces of the intruders, perhaps simply the overwhelming weight of being the center of attention in such a formal, powerful space. "It's okay, sweetie," said. "Take your time. What's your name?" Still nothing. Sarah's small body had begun to tremble visibly. Her eyes had taken on a glassy, unfocused quality that recognized as dissociation. Her daughter was mentally leaving her body as a protection mechanism. "Can you tell me about what happened at Grandma's house?" asked gently. Sarah's breathing became rapid and shallow. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish struggling for air. Then, without warning, tears began streaming down her face. Not the crying of a child expressing sadness, but the silent, anguished weeping of a small human being completely overwhelmed by forces beyond her comprehension. Stood up involuntarily, her instinct to go to her daughter overwhelming every other consideration. The bailiff gently placed a hand on her arm. "It's okay, Mom. Give her a moment," he whispered. But there was no moment of recovery coming. Sarah's distress was escalating. Her breathing became more panicked. Her tiny hands gripped the edge of the witness stand so hard her knuckles turned white. Judge looked helplessly at Gloria, then at the child psychologist who'd been brought to assist. "I don't think she can testify," the psychologist whispered to the judge. "She's in acute psychological distress. Continuing will only cause further trauma." Looked back at Sarah, and for a moment the judge's expression showed the weight of impossible choices. She could force the child to continue, but at what cost? She could stop the testimony, but then how would Sarah's truth be heard? The courtroom was deathly silent except for Sarah's ragged, panicked breathing and the soft sound of her anguished sobs. It was the sound of a child completely locked inside herself, unable to access her own voice, unable to bridge the gap between internal trauma and external expression. Looked over at Officer, who was observing with the focused intensity of someone who'd seen this pattern before. Their eyes met for just a moment. Without words, communicated her desperation. A traumatized child was falling deeper into crisis with every passing second. Traditional courtroom procedure was failing her spectacularly. Something had to change. Someone had to reach her. And that's when Judge made a decision that would deviate from standard procedure, but might be the only thing capable of reaching a little girl whose voice had been stolen by trauma. Officer Robert had been watching the courtroom with the practiced eye of someone who'd witnessed trauma responses hundreds of times. He could read the signs as clearly as if they were written in bold letters across the air. Sarah's breathing was becoming more erratic, her body language shifting from scared to shutting down, her eyes taking on that glassy, distant quality that meant her mind was traveling somewhere beyond the reach of this courtroom. She was disappearing into herself, retreating to whatever internal safe space her nervous system could construct when the external world became unbearable. Knew this pattern well. He'd seen it in abuse victims, in witnesses to violence, in children who'd experienced what no child should ever experience. The body and mind had their own protective mechanisms, primitive survival responses that activated when danger felt imminent and escape felt impossible. Sarah's nervous system was essentially saying, "If I can't flee physically, I'll flee mentally. I'll go somewhere inside myself where the bad things can't reach me." He glanced at Judge, who was observing the situation with visible concern. Their eyes met for just a fraction of a second, but that was enough. Years of working in the legal system had given the ability to communicate volumes without words. He tilted his head almost imperceptibly toward Dakota, a subtle gesture that asked a silent question. "Can I try?" Judge paused for a moment, her judicial mind clearly wrestling with procedure versus compassion. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. That nod changed everything. Stood with fluid, practiced movements, careful not to make any sudden gestures that might startle Sarah further. He walked slowly toward the witness stand, Dakota at his side, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who understood that his approach itself was part of the intervention. Every movement needed to communicate safety, predictability, and non-threat. As he moved closer, quietly asked Sarah a question that was, on the surface, a simple offer of connection. "Sarah, would you like to meet Dakota? He's a very special friend of mine." His voice was gentle, barely above a whisper, but it somehow cut through the ambient noise of the courtroom and reached the traumatized child. Sarah didn't respond verbally, but something in her eyes flickered, a slight refocusing, as if she'd heard something from very far away and was considering whether to respond. That tiny flicker of awareness was all needed. He'd learned that sometimes the path to reaching a traumatized child wasn't through words or logic, but through the offer of something simpler, companionship. Dakota seemed to sense the magnitude of the moment. The dog had worked hundreds of cases, but he never became casual about his purpose. This was serious business. As gave him a subtle hand signal, Dakota transformed before everyone's eyes. His usual playfulness melted away, replaced by an almost sacred focus. His ears perked forward with attention. His tail stopped wagging. His breathing became steady and intentional. The dog approached Sarah slowly, one deliberate step at a time. This was technique refined over thousands of hours of training, never rushing, never approaching directly from the front, never placing the dog in a position that might feel threatening to a traumatized individual. Dakota positioned himself at an angle, approaching from the side rather than head-on, and he kept his body language low and non-threatening. Then, in a gesture that seemed to contain infinite wisdom, Dakota did something that transcended technical training. He gently placed his chin on the armrest of the witness stand, bringing his face to Sarah's eye level. For a moment, there was nothing in the courtroom but the quiet presence of a dog and a traumatized child making eye contact. It was one of those moments that seemed to exist outside normal time. Sarah's breathing, which had been rapid and panicked, began to slow. Her rigid shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears in a protective gesture, started to relax slightly. The glassy distance in her eyes remained, but something had shifted, a subtle change in the quality of her presence, as if some part of her that had been fleeing was beginning to pause and consider returning. Dakota's brown eyes, warm, patient, filled with a kind of understanding that seemed to transcend the difference between species, held Sarah's gaze with complete non-judgment. The dog wasn't asking her to perform or explain or recall traumatic memories. Dakota was simply offering his presence, and the message contained in that presence was wordless but unmistakable. You are not alone. It is safe to be here in this moment with me. Sarah's hand, which had been gripping the edge of the witness stand with white-knuckled intensity, slowly relaxed. With movements so tentative they seemed almost uncertain whether they had permission to happen, she reached out toward Dakota. Her small fingers, trembling slightly, made contact with the dog's soft fur. The entire courtroom seemed to exhale in unison. His hands flew to her mouth, and tears immediately began streaming down her face. Judge set down her pen with deliberate care, her own eyes glistening as she witnessed something extraordinary unfolding before her. Even Thomas Bradford, the defense attorney, watched with an expression that suggested even his legal arguments had temporarily been suspended in the face of something more profound than courtroom procedure. Sarah's fingers began to move through Dakota's coat with gentle, exploratory touches. It was as if the child was discovering, through the tactile connection with the dog's fur, that sensation and connection still existed in the world. The rhythmic, meditative act of petting seemed to be helping Sarah's nervous system recalibrate, to recognize that this moment, this present moment, was safe. Officer remained quiet and present but unobtrusive, giving Dakota and Sarah the space to connect without interference. This was what he'd learned over his years of victim support work. Sometimes the most healing thing an adult could do was step back and let the animal work. His role was not to direct or control the interaction, but to facilitate it, to hold space for it, to trust in the process. After nearly 2 minutes, an eternity in the context of a traumatized child's crisis, Sarah leaned slightly closer to Dakota. The dog remained completely still, as if he understood the precious nature of this moment. Sarah's breathing had shifted from panic to merely anxious to almost calm. Her body, which had been dissociated and distant, was re-inhabiting itself, reconnecting with the present moment. Judge, watching from the bench with an expression of profound compassion, understood that she was witnessing a turning point. This wasn't just a child calming down. This was a traumatized nervous system beginning to recognize that safety was possible, that trust could be rebuilt, that the world still contained goodness. Sarah then did something that made Gloria, the victim advocate, wipe away tears. She reached up with both small hands and gently grasped Dakota's ears, burying her face in the dog's fur. It was a gesture of complete trust, of a child finally finding an anchor in a sea of terror. Felt his own eyes burn with moisture as he watched this profound moment unfold. This was why he dedicated his life to victim support work. This right here, this was justice in its form. Not verdicts or convictions, but healing. Not procedure, but presence. Judge remained completely still, recognizing that any movement, any word, might disrupt the delicate magic happening before her. She was watching a barrier between a traumatized child and the world begin to dissolve. She was watching fear transform into cautious connection. She was watching a little girl remember, in the presence of unconditional animal acceptance, that the world was not entirely made of danger. The courtroom had become a sacred space, no longer a place of accusation and procedure, but a place of profound human and canine compassion intersecting with devastating human need. Sarah remained buried in Dakota's fur, her entire body more relaxed than it had been in the entire courtroom appearance, was openly weeping with a mixture of heartbreak and hope. Officer stood with quiet pride, knowing that his partner had done what lawyers and judges and medical professionals had been unable to do. He had reached a traumatized child in the depths of her isolation and reminded her that she was not alone. In that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood something fundamental. Sometimes healing didn't come through force or procedure or legal maneuvering. Sometimes healing came through the simple, profound power of one being accepting another being completely, asking nothing but presence, offering nothing but love. And in that acceptance, a traumatized little girl began to find her way back. The courtroom had entered a state of suspended animation. Everyone understood, on some fundamental level, that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Time seemed to move differently. Seconds felt like minutes, yet the entire interaction unfolded with the quality of something eternal and unchangeable. Sarah remained buried in Dakota's fur, her small body pressed against the dog's side as if she was trying to absorb safety through physical contact. Her breathing had stabilized into something almost meditative. The panicked, shallow gasps had transformed into slower, deeper breaths. Even her color had improved slightly, the pale, frightened pallor replaced with something more alive, more present. Officer stood motionless, barely breathing, understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing a facilitator could do was remove themselves from the equation. Dakota and Sarah were having a conversation that transcended words, and his job was simply to hold the space for it. He could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom on him, but he kept his focus solely on his partner and the traumatized child. Judge had stopped taking notes. Her pen lay abandoned on the bench. She was simply watching, witnessing, her judicial authority temporarily suspended in the face of something more powerful than law, the raw, undeniable reality of one being reaching another being across an expanse of suffering and fear. Sat frozen, her hands still covering her mouth, tears streaming silently down her face. She recognized something in this moment that her conscious mind might not yet have processed. Her daughter was coming back. Not all the way, not yet, but she was emerging from the internal hiding place she'd retreated to. After what seemed like an age, Sarah shifted slightly. She was still holding Dakota's fur, still close enough to feel the dog's body warmth and heartbeat, but she turned her head just slightly. And then, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, a voice that sounded like it had traveled from very far away, from the depths of a child's internal exile, Sarah spoke. "Good dog." The words hung in the courtroom air like crystalline things, precious and delicate and absolutely transformative. For a moment, nobody moved. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath collectively, as if everyone suddenly understood they were in the presence of something sacred. Then everything happened at once. His hands flew to her mouth as a sound escaped her, not quite a cry, not quite a gasp, but something in between that contained 6 months of desperation, fear, hope, and maternal love. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks as her body began to shake with the release of tension she'd been carrying since that terrible day of the home invasion. Judge's eyes glistened as she looked at her notes and then back at Sarah. Her expression showed the weight of profound recognition. This 2-year-old had not just spoken. She had broken through psychological barriers that had seemed insurmountable. She had found her voice in the presence of unconditional acceptance. Even Gloria, the victim advocate who'd seen countless trauma recoveries, had to wipe her eyes. She understood better than most what those 2 words meant. They meant a child recognizing safety. They meant a nervous system willing to risk communication again. They meant the possibility of healing. Thomas Bradford, the defense attorney, was watching with an expression that suggested even his carefully constructed arguments had been temporarily suspended in the face of human resilience and recovery. He glanced at Daniel, whose own face showed a complex mixture of emotions, perhaps guilt, perhaps understanding of what his actions had set in motion, perhaps the beginning of recognition that this was a child profoundly harmed by circumstances he'd created. Officer felt something move through his chest, a surge of emotion so powerful it was almost physical. In 17 years of police work and 8 years of victim support work, he'd experienced many moving moments. But there was something uniquely profound about witnessing a traumatized child break her own silence. It was as if Sarah had made a conscious choice to trust the world again, and that choice, however tentative, however fragile, was an act of extraordinary courage. Dakota, sensing the significance of what had just occurred, did something remarkable. The dog turned slightly and gently licked Sarah's face, not in a playful way, but in a gesture that seemed to contain recognition and acceptance. The dog seemed to understand that he'd been part of something important, that his presence had helped facilitate a breakthrough. Sarah, instead of pulling away as a traumatized child might have done, wrapped her small arms around Dakota's neck and held on. Her body, which had been rigid with fear throughout this entire courtroom experience, softened into what looked almost like peace. The court reporter's fingers continued moving across her keyboard, documenting every moment for the official record. But everyone understood that words on a page could never truly capture what was happening in this courtroom. Some moments transcended documentation. Some moments were meant to be felt, witnessed, remembered in the hearts of those present. Stood up without seeming to decide to stand. Her body simply moved, drawn toward her daughter by every fiber of her maternal being. The bailiff gently touched her arm to keep her seated. "Let them have this moment," he whispered. Sat back down, but her entire being was focused on her daughter with an intensity that was almost visible. Judge leaned forward slightly on the bench, making eye contact with Sarah. "Sarah," she said softly, "that's a very good dog. Thank you for telling me." Sarah didn't look at the judge. She kept her face buried in Dakota's fur, but her entire posture suggested that she'd heard the words and accepted them. The affirmation from this authority figure, delivered with such gentleness, seemed to further anchor Sarah in the present moment and in the possibility of safety. What struck everyone in the courtroom most profoundly was that Sarah had spoken not to answer a legal question, not to satisfy court procedure, not because anyone had forced her to speak. She had spoken because she'd encountered something that had reached past her fear. Unconditional acceptance in the form of a dog who asked nothing of her, but allowed her to exist in her terror without judgment. Officer stood completely still, but inside he was marveling at his partner. This was what years of training had prepared Dakota for. This. Exactly this. Not apprehension or protection or intimidation, but this. The simple, profound ability to reach a traumatized human being and offer her the gift of being seen, accepted, and loved despite her brokenness. The silence that followed Sarah's 2 words was not empty. It was full of significance, full of meaning, full of a turning point that everyone present recognized would reverberate far beyond this courtroom. Judge looked at the clock on the courtroom wall and then back at Sarah. She could see that the child had reached her limit. Any more questioning, any more demands on her psychological resources would only cause further trauma. But it didn't matter. Sarah had spoken. She'd broken through her prison of silence. "I think," Judge said carefully, "that's enough for today. Sarah, you've been very brave." The judge turned to Officer. "Officer, I'd like to commend you and Dakota. You've demonstrated something important to this courtroom about what real support looks like." Nodded with quiet dignity, his hand resting gently on Dakota's back. Was openly sobbing now, but they were different tears than before. These were tears of hope, of recognition that her daughter, her beautiful broken daughter, had found a way to communicate her truth, not through the traditional mechanisms of courtroom testimony, but through the profound act of trusting again. Sarah remained in Dakota's embrace, and the dog remained completely still, as if understanding that his work here was not yet finished. The healing had begun, but it would continue long after they left this courtroom. In those two words, "good dog," a traumatized child had reclaimed her voice. In those two words, everyone present had witnessed proof that healing was possible, that connection could transcend fear, and that sometimes the most powerful testimony came not through legal procedure, but through the simple act of one being accepting another. The courtroom doors seemed to hold secrets now, the secrets of a miracle that had unfolded within these walls. Judge called for a 30-minute recess, ostensibly to review her notes and consider the testimony. In reality, she needed time to process what she just witnessed and to think carefully about how to translate that profound moment into a legal framework that would actually serve Sarah's best interests. She retreated to her chambers and closed the heavy wooden door behind her. For a long moment, she simply sat in her leather chair, her judicial robes suddenly feeling like they weighed 1,000 pounds. She pulled off her reading glasses and pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to organize her thoughts in a way that would hold up to appellate scrutiny while honoring the truth she just witnessed. The case law was clear enough. In situations where a child had been exposed to domestic violence or dangerous circumstances, custody suspension or supervised visitation was standard procedure. Daniel's negligence in owing money to dangerous individuals that had led to a violent home invasion during his supervised parenting time was more than sufficient grounds for restricted access. The law would support a strict custody modification without question. But what was wrestling with was something more complex. She'd seen Sarah break through her psychological barriers not through legal procedure, not through expert testimony or carefully crafted questions, but through the simple, profound presence of an animal who offered unconditional acceptance. That moment contained truths about healing and resilience that transcended typical courtroom evidence. Stood and walked to her office window, looking out over the city. In her 23 years on the bench, she'd learned that the most important judicial decisions often weren't the ones that followed procedure most rigidly. They were the ones that recognized the humanity of the people involved and tried to serve their actual rather than merely satisfying legal requirements. She thought about Sarah's two words, "good dog." In those words, a traumatized child had reclaimed her ability to communicate, demonstrated capacity for trust, shown resilience and the possibility of healing, indicated that her nervous system could recognize safety when it was offered, revealed that she was not broken beyond repair, merely temporarily overwhelmed. But there was something else, something more subtle that recognized from her decades of judicial experience. Sarah had spoken those words not in fear or compulsion, but in authentic connection. The child hadn't been forced to testify against her father or recount traumatic memories. She'd been allowed to simply be present with a being that offered safety. And in that safety, her own inherent resilience had emerged. Sat back down at her desk and opened her laptop. She began to type her decision, but not in the standard legal format. She wanted to create something unprecedented, a ruling that incorporated victim support K-9 work as a legitimate tool for understanding child testimony and emotional state. She wanted to establish precedent that courts could look beyond traditional testimony to understand the full picture of a child's condition. She typed for nearly 25 minutes, her thoughts organizing into a coherent framework that honored both legal procedure and human compassion. When she returned to the courtroom, everyone could sense that something had shifted. Judge's expression was resolved, clear, purposeful. She sat on the bench and began to read her ruling, her voice steady and deliberate. This court has considered all testimony, evidence, and observations presented in these proceedings, began. The facts are clear. A violent incident occurred during supervised parenting time. Mr.'s financial obligations created circumstances that resulted in danger to a child in his care. This court must prioritize the safety and of Sarah Mitchell. She paused, making eye contact with each person in the courtroom. However, this court also recognizes that we witness something extraordinary in these proceedings today. We observed a traumatized child who could not access verbal communication through traditional courtroom procedures. And we observed how, through the intervention of Officer and his certified victim support K-9 Dakota, that child reconnected with her own capacity for communication, trust, and resilience. Leaned forward intently, her heart pounding. Sarah Mitchell's 2 words good, more profound testimony than many hours of formal questioning could produce. In those 2 words, we see evidence of a resilient child, evidence of a nervous system that can recognize safety when it is offered, and evidence of the capacity for healing that exists within this traumatized young person. Judge set down her written decision and looked directly at Sarah, who was now resting quietly against Gloria, exhausted from the emotional intensity of the morning. As such, continued, this court makes the following determinations. First, custody remains with Mitchell with no change in her primary parental authority. The court recognizes that Ms. Mitchell has provided a safe, loving environment and has actively sought therapeutic support for her daughter. Second, Daniel will be permitted supervised visitation with his daughter, but only in controlled, predictable environments with a neutral third-party supervisor present. These visitations will be scheduled no more frequently than twice monthly, with duration limited to 2 hours per visit. No overnight contact will be permitted until a court-ordered child psychologist determines that Sarah is ready for such contact. Third, this court orders continued trauma-informed therapy for Sarah Mitchell. The child will attend weekly sessions with a pediatric trauma specialist for a minimum of 1 year, with ongoing assessment at that time. Fourth, this court mandates that Mitchell receive additional resources and support for trauma-informed parenting. I'm ordering that the Victim Advocacy Office connect Ms. Mitchell with parenting counseling and support groups, specifically designed for parents navigating child trauma recovery. Fifth, and importantly, looked toward Officer and Dakota. This court is commending the Victim Support K-9 program, and specifically Officer Robert and K-9 Dakota, for demonstrating a powerful tool for understanding traumatized child witnesses. I am recommending that other courts consider incorporating victim support animal programs into their procedures for handling vulnerable witnesses. This case, continued, her voice taking on additional weight and authority, will serve as a model for how courts can better serve traumatized young witnesses. We are not powerless in the face of trauma. We are not bound to force children to relive their worst moments in pursuit of legal procedure. Sometimes, true justice requires us to think creatively, to recognize that healing and legal resolution can work together rather than in opposition. She paused, looking at Sarah directly. Sarah Mitchell's 2 words good dog revealed not weakness or incompetence. They revealed a resilient child who needed the right conditions to communicate her truth. This court recognizes that sometimes the most powerful courtroom moments happen outside traditional procedure, in moments of genuine human and animal connection. Judge looked at Daniel. Mister, I want to be clear. Your actions, your negligence in owing money to dangerous individuals, have resulted in lasting trauma to your daughter. The restrictions I'm placing on your contact with Sarah are not punitive toward you, but protective of her. You will have the opportunity to rebuild a relationship with your daughter, but only when she is ready, only under supervision, and only at the pace that a licensed psychologist determines is safe for her. She turned to Ms. Mitchell. You have demonstrated exemplary parenting under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. This court recognizes your advocacy for your daughter and your commitment to her healing. The resources I'm ordering will support you in the journey ahead. Finally, looked at Officer and Dakota. Officer K-9 Dakota, you have demonstrated what it truly means to serve and protect. Your work today wasn't about apprehension or control. It was about creating the conditions for healing. Please continue this vital work. Courts need you. The bailiff announced the conclusion of the hearing, immediately moved towards Sarah, and Gloria gently lifted the child into her mother's arms. Sarah buried her face in his neck and held her daughter with the desperation and gratitude of someone who'd nearly lost everything and found it again. Officer stood and placed his hand on Dakota's back. The dog looked up at him with those wise brown eyes, and in that glance saw recognition of work well done. They'd come to this courtroom without knowing if Dakota could help, if anything could break through Sarah's protective dissociation. And not only had Dakota helped, he changed the trajectory of an entire case, and by Judge's commitment to setting precedent, potentially changed how courts would approach traumatized child witnesses in the future. Thomas Bradford was reviewing his notes with a complicated expression. His client had been held to reasonable accountability, which was proper, but he also recognized that something larger than legal maneuvering had occurred in this courtroom, something that transcended his role as defense counsel. Judge gathered her papers, her ruling now official. She'd written something that would be published, cited, potentially replicated in other courtrooms. She'd used her judicial authority not just to determine custody, but to legitimize a new approach to serving traumatized children in the legal system. As she returned to her chambers, thought about how this case would stay with her for the rest of her career. It would remind her daily why she'd chosen to become a judge, not to enforce procedure rigidly, but to serve justice in its truest form, protecting the vulnerable, recognizing resilience, and creating space for healing within the formal structures of law. 6 months had passed since that extraordinary day in Judge's courtroom, and the changes in Sarah Mitchell's life were nothing short of miraculous. The playground near her home was alive with the sound of children playing, and among them, running with her arms spread wide like an airplane, was a little girl who'd recently turned 4 years old. "Watch me, Mama, watch me," Sarah called out, her voice ringing with joy that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Stood nearby, a soft smile playing across her lips as she watched her daughter play with a freedom and abandon that had been stolen by trauma, but was now being reclaimed through patient, persistent healing. Sarah had come so far. The nightmares still visited occasionally, perhaps 2 or 3 times a week now instead of every night, but they were less intense, less controlling. When they did occur, Sarah would wake up, and instead of the dissociated panic of earlier months, she could now articulate what had frightened her. "The loud noise scared me, Mama," she'd whisper, and would hold her daughter, validate her feelings, and help her recognize that she was safe in the present moment. The lock-checking rituals had diminished significantly. Where Sarah had once needed to verify every lock multiple times before bed, she now checked them once, sometimes twice, and could be reassured that the house was secure. Her therapist, Doctor, had worked with both Sarah and on trauma-informed strategies. Doctor understood that healing from trauma wasn't about rushing the process or forcing recovery. It was about building Sarah's internal sense of safety gradually, through repeated experiences of being protected and validated. "You're doing amazingly, Sarah," Doctor had told her in their last session. "Your brave heart is learning that the world can still be safe. That takes real courage." Sarah had nodded solemnly, then asked, "Can I tell you about Dakota?" Almost every therapy session now, Sarah wanted to talk about Dakota. She would describe, with remarkable detail for a 3-year-old now 4, the softness of his fur, the warmth of his body, the feeling of safety she'd experienced when she'd buried her face in his coat in that frightening courtroom. Doctor had recognized this as significant. Sarah was processing her trauma through the lens of connection and safety rather than fear and isolation. One of the most significant changes had occurred 3 months after the hearing, when had done something that would prove transformative. She'd adopted a golden retriever named Sunny. The process of choosing a dog, meeting Sunny, and bringing her home had been therapeutic for both mother and daughter. Sarah had watched her mother's face carefully as they'd visited the shelter, and when it said, "Do you think Sonny could be your friend?" Sarah's eyes had lit up with cautious hope. Sonny was gentler than Dakota, smaller, with a coat the color of honey and eyes that seemed to hold infinite patience. The dog had taken to Sarah immediately, as if understanding on some deep level that this little girl needed companionship and unconditional acceptance. Where Sarah's separation anxiety had once been severe, she could now venture into her room to play knowing that Sonny would remain nearby. The dog's presence had become a form of transitional object, something that helped Sarah maintain a sense of safety even when was in another part of the house. Had also transformed during these 6 months. The guilt that had haunted her, the persistent feeling that she should have protected her daughter from trauma that was ultimately beyond her control, had begun to ease. She joined a support group for parents of traumatized children through the Victim Advocacy Office, as Judge had ordered. In those sessions, surrounded by other parents navigating similar heartbreak, had learned that trauma wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something to be honored, to be processed, to be gradually integrated into a life that continued forward. Officer Robert had become something of a local celebrity. His and Dakota's work in Sarah's case had generated significant interest in the Victim Support K-9 program. The courthouse, inspired by Judge's explicit commendation, had allocated additional funding for the program, had been invited to present at several conferences about victim support animals and trauma-informed courtroom procedures. But what mattered most to him wasn't the recognition. It was knowing that his work had made a difference in a child's life. Dakota had aged gracefully through these months, his coat still glossy, his eyes still wise. But noticed that the dog seemed to carry a particular peace after the Sarah Mitchell case. It was as if Dakota knew that his work had helped someone find their way back to life. The bond between officer and dog had deepened even further, if such a thing was possible. Judge had received inquiries from courts across the state about implementing Victim Support K-9 programs. She'd written a detailed article for a legal journal about the intersection of animal-assisted therapy and childhood trauma testimony. Most significantly, she'd become an advocate for trauma-informed courtroom procedures more broadly. She'd begun consulting with other judges about how to modify procedures to better serve vulnerable witnesses without sacrificing legal integrity. Her decision in Sarah's case had been cited in 3 separate appellate decisions as precedent for how courts should approach traumatized child witnesses. It had become known in legal circles as the Mitchell decision, and it represented a significant shift in how the judiciary approached victim protection and support. Sarah's supervised visitations with her father had progressed slowly but steadily. The first few visits had been brief and careful, with a neutral supervisor present throughout. But over time, as Sarah's sense of safety had grown and her capacity for connection had expanded, Daniel had begun to understand the profound impact of his choices. He'd his own therapy, working to understand how his financial troubles had created the circumstances for his daughter's trauma. "I'm so sorry," he'd told Sarah during their 3rd supervised visit, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there to protect you." Sarah had looked at him with the penetrating gaze of a child who'd experienced too much too soon. "You're sad," she'd observed. "Yes," Daniel had admitted. "I'm very sad about what happened to you." "Dakota made me feel better," Sarah had said matter-of-factly. "He's a good dog." That conversation had become a turning point for Daniel as well. He'd recognized that his daughter's healing wasn't about absolving him of responsibility. It was about moving forward, about rebuilding a relationship brick by brick, about proving through consistent presence and emotional accountability that he could be someone Sarah could trust again. The community impact had been remarkable as well. After Judge's commendation of the Victim Support K-9 program, donations had increased significantly. The program had expanded to include 2 additional K-9 teams. Schools in the district had begun inviting officers to present about trauma and animal-assisted healing. Sarah's story, carefully told with attention to her privacy, had become a teaching tool for how compassion and innovation could intersect within legal and therapeutic systems. At the one-year mark of the courtroom hearing, Sarah had grown noticeably. She was talking more, laughing more, engaging with other children at school with a confidence that suggested she was beginning to believe the world contained good things again. Her teacher reported that she was making excellent progress academically and socially, with only occasional anxiety spikes when she heard unexpected loud noises. Had framed a photograph in her home, a picture of Officer in Dakota with Sarah taken by one of the courthouse staff members on the day of the hearing. In the photo, you could see Sarah's tentative smile, Dakota's patient presence, and Officer's quiet pride. Looked at that photograph often, remembering the moment when everything had shifted, when a traumatized child had found her voice again through the presence of an animal who offered nothing but acceptance. One afternoon, as Sarah played with Sonny on the living room floor, she looked up at her mother with thoughtful eyes. "Mama," she asked, "can we see Dakota again?" His heart swelled. "I think we can arrange that, sweetheart. I think Officer would love to see how much you've grown." "I want to tell Dakota thank you," Sarah said with the seriousness of a 4-year-old who understood on some level that a dog had helped save her life. The courtroom moment had not erased Sarah's trauma. Recovery from such profound fear takes time, patience, and persistent commitment. But that moment, when a judge had the wisdom to deviate from procedure, when an officer and his dog had the courage to intervene, when a traumatized child had found the strength to speak 2 words, that moment had changed the trajectory of Sarah's life. It had shown her that healing was possible. It had demonstrated to her that the world still contained beings worthy of trust. It had proven that sometimes the most powerful courtroom moments happened in the spaces between procedure, in the sacred intersection of human need and animal compassion. And it had created ripples far beyond one child's recovery. It had changed how courts approached traumatized witnesses. It had legitimized victim support K-9 programs as essential tools. It had shown that justice, true justice, wasn't always about finding guilt or assigning blame. Sometimes justice was about creating the conditions for healing, about recognizing resilience, about choosing compassion alongside procedure. Sarah's journey from silence to speech, from trauma to hope, had become a testament to human and animal resilience. And everyone who'd been present in that courtroom carried those lessons forward, forever changed by witnessing a little girl learn to trust again.